Next, we meet a civil servant who told us she was so frightened when going out for a run that she called the police for help.
So why was it then that Dr Andrea Charles Fidelis was then threatened with arrest? Ministry of Justice figures show that black people are 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched by the police in England and Wales than white people. And although she wasn't stopped and searched, Dr Fidelis feels that she was, in fact, racially profiled. She joins us now from her home in Kent. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Good morning. Just explain what caused, you think, this man to start following you. What was going on? You were just down your street and you were jogging, weren't you? It was a perfectly normal experience.
Yes, an ordinary kind of Sunday evening, very warm, about 6 o'clock. And he just showed up next to me, very angry, in a big white van. I had no idea what was going on. I was literally just warming up. And he just started, you know, shouting about why was I near his car and on his drive, and his son, he said his son saw me. He himself hadn't seen anything. And that was the bizarre situation that kind of started everything.
And you hadn't been anywhere near his drive? I mean, had you even gone past his driveway?
Yes, I walked past his driveway because that's the road I live on, and he lives on the next road, so his house is on our road, essentially. But it's cocooned by a big hedge, so I most certainly wasn't on his road and on his drive. No, I just walked past.
Right.
And then you carried on, and then this person carried on sort of following you, essentially, and then you felt so worried that you then had to call the police. And what happened then?
Yeah, well, what happened is I didn't have anything on me at the time, so I carried on jogging because I thought this isn't going anywhere, and he then pursued me in his van. He called the police, and I carried on jogging, but as I got to kind of country roads, I began to be really frightened. I didn't have anything on me, so when I turned around and tried to kind of head closer to home, he reversed all the way down the road to keep in tune with me. I immediately ran to the station and called the police then, and then a police officer showed up, which I believe was from his call.
Wow. And then did you try and talk to this gentleman who was following you? Did you sort of say, listen, I didn't do anything, or did you just try not to engage at all?
When he first approached me, I was just very confused, and I said, I don't know what you're talking about. I really didn't. There was no mention of car theft or anything like that at that time. He just said, you were by my drive, my son saw you. So I was in fear of my life. I wasn't talking to him. He wasn't in a position to be spoken to, and he wasn't leaving either.
And supposedly if somebody just says to you, you were by my drive, I mean, that doesn't sound like any kind of serious crime necessarily. So I suppose you were very perplexed at that point and very worried. But what happened when the police arrived then? So that was an interesting moment, wasn't it?
That's the actual interesting moment, because as the police arrived, the station guard, I was in the office, he leaned out and said, she's in here, she's in fear of her life. And before anything, the police officer said to the station guard, she tried to steal a car, she's not in fear of her life, or the other way around. And so then he kind of waded in and said, and then told me that I had tried to steal this man's car. And when I said I was frightened and I'd been through a trauma and I was, you know, confused, and he said, well, he had every right to chase you because you tried to steal his car. And I was just besides myself, really, really upset.
And was it that assumption of guilt before even trying to gather any statement from you or any facts? Is it that assumption of guilt that you describe as the racial profiling, that you now say you've got 2 sons, you know, we hear a lot about it from black men. But is that the moment where you thought, gosh, it's because of the colour of my skin that this police officer believes I'm guilty?
Yes, I think there's 3 aspects to this. So there's a presumption of guilt to begin with, and there's a situation where that particular person, who may well be a potential victim, is not seen as a victim. And then there's like no empathy or compassion in the equation. And so I think those 3 things were what led me to believe that, hang on, there's something amiss here. When the facts become apparent, the narrative should change, but it quite didn't change because we carried on a lot of back and forth. And so, and that's why I believe there's the racialised profiling in this situation.
But interestingly, you mean you work for the Ministry of Justice? I mean, and was it at that point when you described your job that you noticed a change in behaviour and approach from the police officer?
Yes, it was exactly that. He said he threatened to arrest me and said, and I said, you can't arrest me. I've done nothing wrong. And he said, the next thing he said was, what do you do? And then I said, I work for the Ministry of Justice, and the direction changed. But I mean, beyond kind of my story, I really want to have this platform and this voice and to try and work towards better policing. Because what about kind of young black men that want fair treatment and justice? And also I put in a complaint and it was determined that the service was acceptable. And so I think the police reviewing themselves need to think a bit more about how the nuances with racial profiling and bias policing and unconscious bias. It's not just about racial slurs, and it's not just about having another scenario that you can point to and say, you did this there, you did this to me. There's a lot more nuance in it. And I think what's really difficult is that the police officer, when I read his statement in the investigation, he's actually concluded that he has no doubt that I was on the man's drive. And I mean, it's just besides the point that, you know, you have to be able to say, I've made a mistake, you know, and close it down. Say to that man that no crime has been committed as far as I can see. This is your neighbour. Maybe you owe her an apology. But I wasn't afforded that.
What do you think is going on here? Because, you know, it's almost every week we hear an incident like this now. Only recently we remember the couple who were literally driving on their road and they glanced over to a police car and they were stopped for driving in their car. We had the athlete as well, Bianca Williams, who was stopped recently, and that led to nothing. And Danny Rose, only this weekend, has talked about the footballer Danny Rose. I mean, he talked about every time he goes to his hometown of Doncaster in his Range Rover, he gets stopped as well. I mean, there seems to be some sort of pattern here, but what do you think it is? Do you think that it's out-and-out racism from the police? Is it unconscious bias? Is it the way they are looking at crime? Is it a strategy thing? What do you think is the real problem here?
So there's a lot of things that you mentioned there. I think there is, I mean, I read a book called In Search of Belonging by Michael Fuller, who was a chief constable for Kent Police, a black constable. And he was saying that, like, over his kind of 40-year career, there was a strategy in the earlier days. I mean, in the canteens, they had NF posters in the Met. And so I think over the years, things have become less acceptable, but there is still an entrenched and ingrained amount of kind of racism and potential, I don't know if it's unconscious or if it's conscious bias, but all I know is that when people are not being treated fairly, when questions are not being asked, then we've got a problem. And as you say, it's playing out in the news every day.
And Andrea, we've got a statement from Kent Police, and it says, as a force, we take racial equality and discrimination of any kind very seriously, strive to ensure fairness and diversity across the force. In this instance, we are sorry that we failed to leave Dr Charles Fidelis with a positive impression of Kent Police, and we will work to restore her confidence. And it's just as a final question, as a mum, you know, you've got two young boys. How have you talked to them about how to behave around the police when they go out? Has it changed your conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I'm petrified of them going out. And yes, my 20-year-old, he's been stopped and searched numerous times, and he pretty much knows how to conduct himself. And it's often a case of just being very calm and just trying to get through the situation without it being escalated unnecessarily.
Okay. Dr Andrea Charles Fidelis, thank you so much for coming on and telling us your story. A very important story. Thank you very much.